favorite pastors and theologians from like way back in the day. And I used to interpret that as saying man must give up all they have to buy the treasure, which is Christ. And Jesus is that treasure. No doubt he is a treasure. But what is that story really talking about? It's really talking about how Jesus, the Father, the Spirit have given up everything they can have to prove to you that you are that treasure hidden in the field. That you are everything they could ever want in a being to be a part of their fellowship and their Trinity. That you are now a part of their Godhead. That he will go to any means necessary to purchase that treasure, which is you. I think that's a beautiful thing because you can't give enough to buy Jesus, right? So to think about that, he's asking you to give up all you have to purchase himself, then that just becomes religion, and all that becomes is your ability and strength to buy Jesus, and he doesn't want any of that. There's no relationship and joy found in that. So I love that song. Good job, Jay. Is everything good with the video? Yeah. Is everything good with the video? Okay, awesome. Are you going to stay out here, or what are you going to do? I don't know, it's up to you. Okay. All right, so we're going to talk about this thing called suffering today. We titled it Loneliness and Suffering. Gave you a little bit of an outline. This thing... I think it's okay. Is it showing okay? There you go. There you go. We got 3 points here: God's role in suffering, God's strength in suffering, and God's destruction of suffering, okay? One thing that I think we struggle with a lot of times when it comes to suffering in our lives, because last week we talked about Job, right? We talked about the story of Job in the Bible and how we think that sometimes God and Satan have like this relationship with one another, and God like uses Satan for his purposes, and it's almost like this in the story of Job. God like uses Satan to prove to Job who he is, and he like has Satan on a leash, and he says, I'm going to let you do, Satan, whatever you want, and you can, kill Job's family, you can destroy his house, just make sure you don't touch him, right? And it looks like God is kind of flippant with Job's life, and he doesn't really care that Satan has this life and this thing that he's doing to Job, and it's almost like God's like, whatever, and in the very end, I'm going to be glorified. And that's kind of how we teach that message. But we learned last week, during that time, it was the Day of Atonement, where actually the story of Job is God coming to the aid of Job when he's under sin and death, when he's under the suffering, in order to show Job that he's actually the one to save him from the suffering. That he's the one that he's trying to get rid of every accusation that Satan had against him and destroy that accusation. Remember, if you were here last week, what is the accusation that Satan has against all of us? What was the song we just heard? Sons and daughters, right? What's the accusation? Is his accusation that he wants to get you to commit lust? Is his accusation does he want you to be bitter, or he wants you to be angry? What's really the deepest temptation he wants you to believe, and what's the accusation he wants you to have in your life?
He wants us to question our identity.
Yeah, he wants you to question, am I really a son of God? Do I really belong in his family? Do I really belong to him? And the way Satan tries to prove to you that you don't belong to him is what? Look at your life. Look at all the sin you have. Look at what you've done. How can you be like him? How could you really have his image and likeness if you see all these things manifesting in your life? And that's what Satan was doing to Job. So God comes to the scene to prove to Job all those things are a lie. Nothing can separate you from his love. No peril, no nakedness, no distress, no sin, and no death can separate you from him. So we talked about that last week. So this week I want to talk about, not only does Satan use your flesh to accuse you in front of God, but he also uses the suffering in this world to accuse God of not being good. You see the opposite? He not only tries to accuse you of how terrible you are, how you don't belong with God, but he also, in your presence, tries to accuse God of not being good. And you know how he tries to prove that? With suffering. He tries to make you look at the suffering in this world to try to prove to you that God is not for you. Or if he's not for you, at least he's so far away, because if there's evil and sin in this world, he must be doing something else. He must be involved with something else. But what I love about the story of God, and I think the main reason why we struggle with this thing of suffering and sin in this world, is because we use things like God's sovereignty and his control over everything to describe, and we almost have this weird thought, if God is in control, if he's sovereign, right, and we use these words like as if he's in control of all things, how does sin and evil still exist, right? But we need to understand, what does it mean where God is in control? Because let me ask you this, do you think God is in control of everything? We say that kind of like, yeah, of course, he's in control of all things, right? He's sovereign, he's all-powerful, he must be in control of all things. But in actuality, God has chosen freedom as the source of his life. He has given you freedom so that love can be the source of all things. He doesn't want you to be a robot, right? He's come into this world not to make you do things, not to force you to be a part of his fellowship. He wants you to freely see and be persuaded in your own heart of his goodness towards you. And that's what makes God so amazing and powerful. He doesn't have to use a magic wand to persuade you, right? He doesn't have to come and just like, oh, I zap you into my kingdom. He's so powerful that he can literally do it with his own love. He can woo you. He can persuade you of his goodness in your life. That's so much more powerful, isn't it? Than just like using my power, I'm going to make you come. Instead, he does it with his persuasion and his love. That takes so much more power and effort and persuasion, okay? So there's this difference we see in Scripture, like this idea of God's plan for our life. Have you heard that before? God has a plan for your life. And we have beautiful scriptures that talk about how he has a plan for your life. He wants to prosper you and not to harm you, to give you a hope and a future. And we all go to that metaphor of God has a plan. But sometimes we take it so far. We think it means like God has everything in your life planned out. Like he's an architect where there's nothing that surprises him, nothing ever excites him. It's almost like he's so bored with your life because he knows everything that's about to happen. And if you start seeing God only in that way, you don't really see him as the friend or the lover of your soul that's going through life with you. That when you get surprised, he also gets surprised with you. That when you experience sorrow and shame and death, he experiences all those feelings with you, right? And so he reinterprets this idea of plan. Instead of plan, he almost reinterprets it to story. Plan versus story, where he's like the God of endless possibilities. That where if you feel like you're going off the beaten path, he's not shaken up by it. He can go with you with any path you have chosen, and he can be in that place of endless possibilities. And he can show you that whichever path you have chosen in your life, whether it's a good path or a bad path, he is there in the midst of it, persuading you, loving you, and guiding you into his truth. Because the moment you feel like you're outside of God's path, what does that do to your heart? Yeah, you feel like, man, maybe God's not with me anymore. You see it all throughout Scripture, right? Man interprets their suffering, their disease, their inability to win battles in the Old Testament, and what do they normally think? We've done something wrong. God's not with us anymore. We must have gone off the path he has for us, right? And man interprets their suffering that way, instead of realizing that maybe they lose a battle, and that's just a part of God's endless possibilities for their life, where they can trust God in losing. They can trust God in winning, right? And I'm starting to see God in this way where it's almost like he's having a constant conversation with my life, where he's like, hey, Shane, where do you want to go in this direction? Do you want to continue at Magnolia High School teaching, or do you want to go this direction? Do you want to continue doing this thing at church, or do you want to preach about this? It's almost like he's having a constant conversation with me, and whatever thing I choose, he's with me with endless possibilities. Now, what's so amazing about that truth is there's joy and excitement in all those possibilities. And there's never a fear that I'm outside of God's plan for my life, right? So I think that's been a struggle that Satan has come to our lives, and he said, you've gone off the beaten path. You've gone off God's plan. But God is reinterpreting all these things with the person of Jesus, with a God of endless possibilities. And I want to show this to y'all. I forgot to pull it up. Let me pull it up to y'all real quick. In Hebrews, I believe it's chapter 12. It talks about Jesus' blood and what it does to us. Now, we see all throughout Scripture, see if I can find it. I think it's the very end. There it is. All right. The moment you see suffering in your life, what does the Old Testament a lot of times interpret their suffering as? Punishment, right? Maybe God is doing something to us because we've gone off His plan. We've done something wrong. What is happening? Why are we suffering? And we see that in the story of Job, right? Yeah, or He's disciplining me with violence, right? He's using violence, death, disease, destruction to make me better, or to change who I am, or to make my character grow, right? We teach that all the time. Now, what's the problem with that theology? Remember in Job, what was Job all the time thinking when he saw the suffering in his body? Remember what his wife told him? I'm glad this is not my wife, but hopefully we all have better wives than that. But what does his wife say to him? Yeah, man, you must have done something wrong. Just curse God and die so you can be relieved from the suffering. What is she really saying to Job? Who's the cause of his suffering? God Himself. But if you look at the story, behind the story, who's the one actually causing the suffering? Satan, right? There's something going on in this world that there is suffering and distress. So God's role in suffering is not that He imputes sickness. He does not cause the suffering. He does not flippant with our lives where He's trying to prove a point, make you get to know Him better by putting a disease on you, doing these things. But He is actually opposing your suffering. And we're going to get to the very end. How does God answer the question of suffering in this world? How does He destroy it, and how does He give us strength in the midst of that suffering? Now, the moment we see all these violence in this world, what does man naturally think God should do? When you see violence, when you see evil, what do you think man naturally thinks God should do? Just, kill them all, right? Kill Hitler, right? Kill those dudes that are, we just had a shooter, what was it called? Active shooter training at my school. Hear all these stories that they tell us at the beginning of the intro of these guys that came into school, kill elementary kids. It's just crazy to think about how sick these people are. And naturally, man thinks justice is to kill those kids, or to kill that man that did those things, right? To destroy those people. God, come in and just take that kid out and send that kid to hell, right? That's just like naturally what we think God should do. That if there's violence, God should repay it with violence. But Jesus comes to the scene and He reinterprets violence, okay? And this is what this verse is talking about. It says, Jesus, the mediator of a new covenant, and the sprinkled blood, which speaks better than the blood of Abel. Do y'all remember the story of Abel? So Abel comes before God, and he's pleasing before God. We're not going to get in all the details of the story. But Cain gets very jealous of Abel. Now, who remembers, what does Cain do to Abel? He kills him, okay? He kills his brother. Now, what does every man in this world think, or every woman, think that God should do when Cain kills Abel? Vengeance. Justice, right? According to what we view justice as. Kill that dude named Cain. He's done wrong. He deserves to die. Okay? Think about Jesus' blood now. He's using this analogy of vengeance for Abel's blood, and he's describing the blood of Jesus, okay? So think about it. Who puts Jesus on the cross? We do. In Acts it says, you killed the Prince of Life. He's talking to all mankind. God didn't put him there. It wasn't God's anger that put him there. Man took their creator and put him to a cross. Violence, right? We killed Jesus. What does man think that God should do to us? Destroy everybody, right? But what does Jesus' blood speak better than the blood of Abel? Instead of his blood speaking violence, justice, in the sense of getting what we deserve, instead of thinking about vengeance and destroying all mankind for doing this evil deed, what does Jesus do on the cross? He says, forgive them, for they do not know what they're doing. And also, God includes us into his Son. He unifies us with his story. Instead of coming with the blood of vengeance, he comes with forgiveness. He reinterprets what God does in the midst of suffering and violence in this world. He doesn't come to destroy mankind. He doesn't come to destroy man who commits these evil deeds, but he comes and reinterprets it by forgiving men, by setting man free from their distress and their bondage that's causing the evil and sin in this world. You see how Jesus reinterprets the story of mankind? While man thinks violence should be repaid with violence, God comes to scene and he says violence is repaid with forgiveness. Violence is repaid with salvation. Violence is repaid with his goodness. You see this amazing interpretation change. And that's God's role in suffering. We see this in James chapter 1. Very popular verse. The story of James is all these people are suffering and persecution, and they're probably wondering, where is God in my suffering? Why isn't God setting me free from the suffering? Why isn't he vindicating or going against these men that are causing persecution and evilness to come against me? And so James actually talks about what is God's role in the suffering? Because a lot of times we think God is the one causing the suffering in our life. But James actually tells us, he says, consider it pure joy when you encounter various trials, knowing that the testing of your faith produces endurance. And let endurance have its perfect result, so that you may be perfect and complete, lacking in nothing. But if any of you lacks wisdom, let him ask of God, who gives to all generously without reproach, and it will be done and given to him. But he must ask in faith without doubting. Now, that sounds very hard. With faith and without doubting. That sounds very difficult, right? That word without doubting in the Greek, it means without distinction, without favoritism, okay? So he wants you to believe that in the midst of your suffering, in the midst of your trials, that he's coming to your aid, and he wants you to believe that truth without distinction. What does that mean? When you have distinction or favoritism towards a situation, what does that usually mean? What does it mean to have faith without distinction, without favoritism? It means to believe that God is for you in your suffering without any thoughts or distinction of your flesh. Right? Is everything okay? She locked you out? Oh, dang. Okay. Just leave her in there and see what happens. All right, so it means to be without distinction, meaning you believe that God's for you in the suffering. He's there to aid you in your suffering without any thought of your sin or your rebellion against him as a thought of him being there for you. You know, a lot of times when we think about, is God going to bless my marriage? Is he going to bless my life, my children, whatever it is that you're going through in your life? What does a lot of times our thoughts go to? Am I doing everything right? Right? Am I going to church? Am I giving? Am I being generous? Am I doing good things for other people? Then God will be for me, right? But this verse is actually saying, have faith that God is for you without any distinction, without any thought that your sin could ever separate you from his life. Are y'all trying to open the door? So if you're watching online, our kid locked herself in the door, in the room. So we're opening the door right now and taking off the door. Can you do me a favor, Jay? Can you point that fan towards me? It's kind of distracting. It's kind of hard to.
A little bit.
Yeah. All right, so I'll keep on reading. For that man ought not to expect that he will escape anything from the Lord, being double-minded man and stable in all his ways. But the brother of humble circumstances to glory in his high position, and the rich man is to glory in his humiliation, because like flowering grass he will pass away. So I want to get to this part right here. So keep in mind the context, right? He's talking about suffering. He's talking about temptation in this world and trials. And he wants you to know that God is not the source of the trial. And he's going to prove that to us. Let no one say when he is tempted, that word tempted means tested or trialed, that I am being tempted by God. For God cannot tempt anyone with evil, and he himself does not tempt anyone. But each one is tempted or tested when he is carried away and enticed by his own lust. So what is James trying to tell us? God is not the source of your trials. He's not the one putting the trial in front of you, the temptation in front of you, the testing in front of you to prove a point or to make you better. What does trial come from? It comes from Satan. It also comes from just the things in this world, the desires of this world, trying to find life through our own ability that happens in this world. And he's the one that comes to the aid in the midst of those trials. Yeah. So a lot of times we think, yeah, absolutely, yeah. If you smoke cigarettes or if you commit a crime, there's natural consequences to those things, right? But God is not testing us. He's not tempting us in those things. He's not causing those things to happen. His role is actually, James actually tells us, this is verse 17, every good thing given and every perfect gift is from above, coming down from the Father of lights, with whom there's no variation or shifting shadow. You see the context? There's nothing shifting about God. It's not like 1 second he's going to cause you to have cancer, and then the next second he's going to heal you, right? He's not 1 second going to cause bitterness to come in your heart and then save you from the bitterness, right? He's not shifting a shadow. He does only one thing. He gives life. Satan comes to steal, kill, and destroy, but Satan does only those things, but God only gives life, okay? That's what James is trying to convince us. In the midst of your tribulation, in the midst of your suffering, God's role is that he gives only good things. He's not the cause of the suffering. He's not the result of the suffering. He's there to aid you in your suffering, okay? Yes.
So, my wife got this daily devotional from this very popular lady speaker or whatever.
Mm.
And I read one the other day about suffering.
Yeah.
And she, in this devotional, says that when we suffer, that we should praise God for our suffering.
Right.
And welcome that suffering.
Right.
I mean, do you think that that's true? Or
No.
for me, it kind of goes against when somebody's suffering,
Yeah.
what you do.
Have empathy.
You go and you
Yeah.
pray for them.
Yeah, to be relieved of that
Somebody's in
suffering.
the hospital or whatever
Yeah.
it is, you pray for God's will, which is that they be healed.
Absolutely.
And it's-
Yeah. You know, suffering is contrary to what God desires for our life. But he tells us we will encounter suffering in this world. But the beautiful truth, and now we're going to go on to the strength of suffering. How do we have strength in the midst of our suffering? He tells us that he has overcome the world, that he's overcome the suffering. What does that mean? What does it mean that Jesus overcomes the suffering? You know, we think of God as this like super far away being. He sees man suffering, and he's just kind of sitting back, letting us suffer, okay? But really the strength that comes from suffering, the strength that comes when in the midst of suffering, is knowing that he does not endorse suffering, he does not allow suffering, but really he is in the suffering with you. That is the strength that gives us power in the suffering. Not that God is sitting back, letting us suffer, but that he is actually in it with you. That he took upon the very suffering we all experience on a daily basis, and he is so one with you, unified with you, that he experiences everything that you experience on a daily basis. And why is that such good news? We're not alone in our suffering. You know, what makes us feel so connected to somebody in our suffering? Huh? They're with us, right? They know what we feel. They experience what we experience. It makes us feel connected with that person, right? Kind of an example of this, when I was in, I'm going to use that example that Johanna used, that she told me earlier. When I was in high school, I had this friend. I'm not going to say who it is because I'm not going to embarrass this guy. It wasn't you, Chase, but it was someone else. But I had this buddy that I found out peed sitting down, okay? And of course, I'm a jerk. I make fun of the guy, okay? I'm like, you pee sitting down? What a weirdo. What are you, a woman? No, I'm just kidding. I don't know. That's a bad thing to say. Is that a bad thing to say? But I'm like, dude, like, why do you pee sitting down, okay? I'm like, that's kind of weird. And he kind of felt condemned by me by saying that, okay? And I was like, oh, dude, I'm sorry. I didn't know guys actually did that. And he felt alone in that situation. But then later on, we went to this camp. I think it was like a football camp we went to. And we found out there was like multiple guys that peed sitting down. And we're like, dude, you're not alone in this situation. He felt more connected to that other guy because he peed sitting down with him, right? And they used to have like buddy pees. We call them buddy pees, where you pee together, you know? It was kind of weird, okay? And we're like, man, that's kind of interesting that you found connection to this weird thing from this other person. And that's a funny, weird example that we use to describe that whenever you feel connected to somebody, they experience what you have experienced, you feel one and close with that person. If God never entered the suffering, if he just took away the suffering, right? Could you ever feel close with that guy? You'll be all the time still judging yourself according to the circumstances you see in your life. He would only set you free from the suffering, but never set you free from the power of suffering. You see the difference? He could relieve the suffering, but he much rather sets you free from the power that suffering had over your life. What was the power that suffering had over your life? Whenever suffering happened, what happens? You lose hope, distress. You all the time found your joy, your happiness in what you saw happening in your life. And God's goal is to show you that he is in the suffering with you, so that he can give you the strength to still find joy in the midst of the suffering. So that when the suffering is completely eradicated, you're now completely set free to enjoy the fellowship with God because you are so connected with him. Your relationship has blossomed to this new height, knowing that God has experienced everything that you've experienced. You see that beautiful thing? Okay? So this is 1 Corinthians 10. This is kind of a verse that's taken out of context, I think, a little bit. It says, no temptation has overtaken you. This is like trials or tribulations. That word temptation can be like testing. Suffering in this world is another word you can describe here. But such as is common to man, meaning people have suffered with you. The suffering you've experienced, people have experienced with you, okay? And God is faithful, who will not allow, okay, you to be tempted beyond what you are able. And this is a word we use so much in our churches, where we think God says he allows the suffering. Have you heard words like that? He allows you to suffer, okay? And I don't like that word. I don't like the word allow, because think about it. If someone comes into my house, let's say a neighbor sees somebody coming to my house trying to kill my wife and daughter, okay? And he says, I just allowed them to do it. Now, not necessarily that guy didn't do anything to my wife and daughter, but who am I going to be really mad at? That guy that allowed those things to happen. And yet we use phrases like, God allowed my son to die. He allowed these things to happen in my life. He allowed these things to happen. Almost like God is not responsible. But deep down in your heart, if you think God allowed these things to happen, you're never going to trust that guy. Because you're going to be all the time thinking he could have stopped it. He could have done something. Why didn't he change this suffering? Okay? That's not what this verse is talking about at all. What he's describing here is he's not going to allow you to go through the suffering without strength. He's not going to allow you to go through the suffering alone. He's not saying he's allowing the suffering. He's saying he won't allow you to go through that suffering without him with you.